And I did use Galleon's textbook. And the typical day for this class was they would come, do group work. I would give them a worksheet with new material, definitions or theorems, and they would prove or do examples or whatever. And then they would do presentations on it once most of the groups had finished those worksheets. And so that was, and I'll go into more detail with that, but the second class was topology that I did more recently, and that was the first time it was offered at my university, so it was the first time I taught the class, and it only had 4 students, so it's kind of a big difference for me to go from an IBL with 20 down to 4. They were all math majors, 3 of whom planned on going to grad school for math. At this point, only 1 is still planning on it, but they were experienced math people who had other proof-based classes. I don't think it was my class that kept the other 2, but they liked math, basically. We spent the first half of the semester going over some point set topology, and then the second half I wanted to do more of the modern topics that might be a little more interesting, so we just kind of mixed up things at that point. And I did not have a student textbook for the class. I used different texts that I was pulling from, as I created the lessons. But for this class, they created their own textbook. And otherwise, the in-class was intended to be pretty similar. I give them a worksheet. We worked as one group, basically, because it was only 4 students, and then they would do presentations and whatnot. I did have more, at least later in the semester. They were given what I called a board work problem that they had to have ready at the beginning of the next class, and they would go ahead and just write their answer on the board at the start of class. So that was something new. So here are some of the policies that we're going to figure out. Did it work or didn't it work? What did I do wrong or right? I don't know that we'll get to all of them. I think I went a little long on the talk, but I put the one that I considered most important first so that we could definitely talk about that, and then hopefully we'll get to some of the others. So participation, I guess it's pretty important in inquiry-based learning, and so I feel like I should grade participation in some way, and I've tried a couple of different ways of doing it now. So we'll talk about that. And then there's things with tests, portfolios and textbooks, so kind of student-created documents, collections of what they did during the semester. And as I go through each of these policies, we're going to talk about, did it work? I'm going to ask you, did you think it worked? So I'm going to kind of give you the information that I had going into the class, how many students there were. I'm going to give you kind of what I put in the syllabus or something like that, so basically what I knew before actually implementing these policies. And I want you to guess, obviously I thought they would work because I did them, but I want you to guess, do you think that they actually did work? And if not, why? So here's some things to consider when I'm saying worked. Maybe it worked for one of those and not the others. Does that mean it worked overall? You can think about that. So first thing, the participation. We'll start with abstract algebra. This is what was in the syllabus. This was my first IBL class, and I was kind of worried about would the students actually jump in and participate. And so I wanted to motivate them to do so. And so I made this, it ended up being about 1/4 of their overall grade, so a pretty big percentage. And they started with 0 points. The whole grading system for this class was building up points, starting from 0. And they could build up points in these 3 ways: attending class and participating in their groups, going to the board, and asking questions or answering questions. And so I didn't want to have to call on people a lot because, as a student myself, it made me nervous if I knew I could be. So I was trying to make it more volunteer-based. That was somewhat the motivation behind this system. So now the question is, do you think that this worked? And why or why not? So I'll give you, 30 seconds or a minute, and you can decide, do you think this was successful? And then I'll do a poll. All right, I think that was a minute, and there's a lot of good talking going on, but I am going to have to let's do the poll. Hopefully that was enough time to make just the big decision. Do you think it worked or not? So how many people think that this worked? Let's do a thumbs up if you think it worked. No, maybe. Yeah. So you're right. It did not work. It did not work. Although in some aspects it really did work. Because this may have happened anyway, regardless of the point system, but the class had a great atmosphere. I mean, these students jumped right in with talking, going to the board, answering and asking questions when we did a whole class discussion. A lot of the time, didn't have to say anything. When I had a peer observe me, his comment on my class was it was a tour de force. It was just like he was so amazed by the atmosphere of, not having a lecture at the board and having the students doing so well. It sort of worked because I did have everyone participating. But so what was the bad? Why do nobody thought it was a thumbs up? Anybody want to share? It's awful to keep track of. That's going to be on the next slide. Anything else? Yeah.
I worry about you just using volunteers instead of calling.
What's the worry there? Just using volunteers.
People that just sit back and watch this show.
Yeah.
That not everyone is responsible for, you could just come in and unprepared.
That's a good point. Yeah, they don't necessarily have to be as involved as if they had the threat of being called on, right?
Did you have any instances, or did you have less instances of failure at the board if they were volunteering? So they went up for problems they already knew they had?
There were still plenty of mistakes that went up to the board. Yeah, there was plenty to discuss there. So, there might have been less than there would have been, but there was still plenty. And sometimes I encouraged the people that had the wrong answers to volunteer. And usually if I encouraged them to, they would go ahead and do that. Yeah. The students did not like it. That was the main thing that I heard on the end of the semester evaluations. But the other thing was it made the class competitive, which I didn't foresee that, but I can see how it happened, right? They're competing for these points at this, who's going to get to do this problem at the board. And I didn't intend for that. I know, the Moore method kind of had some level of competition in it, but I didn't really intend for that to happen. So I don't really want the competition level. Again, it was too hard to keep track of points, but the students did not like the way this was done. And so I definitely wanted to change how I did participation once I went on to do topology. So this is how I approached topology, which again, I did move from 20 students down to 4, but I switched from 25% of their overall grade to this was about 10%. They started out at 100% participation and then would lower, if things weren't going well. And you might notice I made the syllabus almost as vague as possible in contradiction to what I had before. So I really was changing it up because even though the other class had great participation, it just didn't really work. So now I'm wondering, do you think this worked? All right, in the interest of getting to the other non-participation topics, I'm going to go ahead and move along and do the poll. So how many think this went better or this worked? Anybody? There's a few thumbs up this time, so you're more hopeful for me. Well, it did not. It did not work at all. And some of this may have been just the 4 students that ended up being in the class. One of them was extremely gifted to the point where I would write a test and his answers would have jokes in them because it was so easy. But then the other 3 students were getting C's or D's on the test. And so he always knew the right answer and didn't want to speak up because he always knew the right answer. And then 2 of the other students, I think because there were only 4 in the class and I was doing this as IBL, so I wasn't lecturing, they didn't take the class seriously. And so they did not learn the definitions or study, and so they weren't really able to contribute in class very well. And then the 4th student loved to talk and loved to participate, but he really struggled with material. Topology is not easy. And so everything that he said was wrong. And so it was really hard. And I ended up lecturing a lot more than I meant to. I mean, they still did presentations all semester and stuff, but it did not end up the way I'd intended the class. I thought, with 4 people, we'd get really comfortable with each other and just work together, and it would be great, and that's not how it turned out. So I may save this for the question portion at the end of the talk, what would you recommend for me to do for participation? Because obviously I still don't have a perfect system in terms of participation. I still feel like I should grade participation in some way to motivate the students to, do it in class, but I have not figured out the best way. So the next policy I had in abstract algebra was oral exams. I thought, they're spending all this time learning how to communicate mathematics in the class. I should put that into part of their exam grade. And so they had 2 oral exams for each of their 2 class tests, not the final, and it was about 12% out of 100%. And they would come to my office, write the proof on the board, and talk me through it as they're writing it. They could ask for hints if they got stuck, and depending on how big of a hint it is, I would take off points. And the first oral, they had a list of proofs that we'd already done in class, and it came from that. The second one was a completely new theorem involving a completely new definition that they'd never seen before, and they had to prove that for me. So, did it work? Discuss. All right, I'm going to do the poll. Do you think it worked, if you did? See, not too many hands. So you might want to tell me why they don't think it worked? Too hard for me. Yeah, that was definitely a problem. It was a huge time commitment, more than I expected. This was the 20 student. This is 20 students. So that was definitely one of the negatives, but did the benefits outweigh that?
I was thinking that the oral exam doesn't give students enough time to sit and think about the ideas and get their head around it. And so they're on the spot and they'll freeze up, I think, more likely than they would to sort of really show you what they can do.
Yeah, and certainly going into the first oral, I know that a lot of them were really anxious about it because they knew they were going to, have to perform for me, basically.
Work because of the fact that you said for that first oral exam, you gave them the proofs in advance for them, so they actually had a way to be somewhat prepared and so on.
They could have just studied that list and learned it for the first one. They did know going into the second that it was going to be, a new one. All right, let's reveal. It did work, or at least I think it worked. Other than the time commitment, which I forgot to put on the slide, that was the major minus. I mean, it took about a week of my office time. Every student was able to successfully finish their proof for both oral exams, even the new one. Sometimes a few of them had to ask for some hints, but there were no major hints. Pretty much the most points I took off, I think, was 2 out of the 12 or something like that. So even the students that really struggled in this class, they were able to do this. And even though they came into the first one, I think, with a lot of anxiety, because, they probably had never had an oral exam before, I haven't, it was actually the students with test anxiety that I think it ended up helping the most, which really surprised me. One student who had severe test anxiety, where she would get C's on her test when she could have A in the rest of the class, she came out of this saying it was the best part of the class for her. For some reason, being able to talk it through with me was a lot easier than, being alone, writing, and getting those 12 points made her feel more comfortable about the rest of the test. And then another student that was one of, I would say, the ones that struggled most in the class, she actually gave me a high five at the end of her first oral exam. She was so excited to get it right and do well with that. And I got a lot of positive feedback on that at the end of the semester.
Was there a time limit for them to be able to get the proof? Or how long did it take?
So the first one I scheduled 10-minute blocks. You all know that was not smart. It took about depending on the students, anywhere between 10 minutes and 30. And so the second oral exam, I scheduled 30-minute blocks for everyone, and I think they were all able to finish it within that amount of time, even the new proof. So I'm going to go on to, just so we can finish out this kind of policy about exams. Well, actually, I guess I don't have a lot to say about topology for it because I didn't do it in topology. So yeah, you can go ahead. No, that's okay.
Okay. No, I just want to give some anecdotal story. When I was in analysis, my professor did this, but your grade depends on how many questions you can answer. He'll start with easy questions and make the questions harder and harder.
Yeah.
If you got onto the A questions and solved them, you get an A. If
That's
you got
interesting.
flunked out around B or C, that's the grade you got. So
See,
we would wait outside the classroom.
I was trying to make it as low pressure as possible.
And we would wait outside the
I
classroom
feel like that.
and time how long people will
Yeah.
stay in the room, and we say, he got an A.
Yeah.
Or not an A, definitely not an A.
That's interesting. Yeah. So as you can see at the bottom of the slide, I didn't do this in topology, in part because once I got into the class and saw how the 4 students were, I didn't feel comfortable. I guess I wasn't hopeful that it would be successful, even though it was so successful last time. So I guess one question I have for you all would be, do you think I should have gone ahead and done this, even though I wasn't, I guess, optimistic about how it would have gone? And I'm just about out of time for the question part of the talk, but I'll just mention the other things briefly. In abstract algebra, I did a portfolio where they had to revise all the proofs that we did in class and homework proofs, which was quite a few by the end of the course. And the did it work part of this, I'll just go ahead and say, yes, I do think that worked, and I have copies of these if you're interested in seeing it. I recommend having students do some sort of portfolio, or for topology, I had them do the student textbook, where they got feedback on it once. If it was a homework proof, they got the feedback. If it was an in-class proof, we were correcting it at the board. But it surprised me how many of them, when it went into the portfolio, there were still a number of mistakes there. But then after getting it revised just one more time with corrections, and then them going back and looking at the proof again and thinking about it again, almost all of them were perfect. This was probably the assignment I gave the most A's on in anything I've ever assigned. And I was really impressed by the quality of their portfolios. But it was another really time-consuming thing on the part of the teacher. It would take about another week of time. And in topology, I did the textbook. I didn't do a portfolio because I thought that might be too much. And I also have a copy of their textbook here if you're interested in seeing that. And they had to basically take everything we did in class with theorems, examples, definitions, all of that, and they typed it up online, and I would grade it and give them feedback on it. And then I intended for them to use it to study and stuff like that. And for the success of this, I still don't know. I don't know if they actually used it in the way that I intended. The final product looks pretty nice, but I don't know with the weaker students I don't know if they would have been helped more by having an actual textbook. This one I'm just not sure about. So I think the textbook thing is a good idea, and maybe it helped them. I just don't really know. Thank you. So now just whatever suggestions you have for me for how to fix the things that didn't work, or other questions you might have.
Well, you asked earlier about your points, and I think I do have a solution for you there. If I have a mature class, then I don't give a point for every question that's asked.
Yeah.
But if I have an immature class or lower level class, then I give points for every single question asked.
So how do you keep track of that?
Well, that was what I was
Yeah.
going to tell you. You print a roster, and then you keep it on a clipboard, and it's just with you all the time.
So I
and
did
then
that.
every
It was
time a
still-
kid asks a question, you just put a little
Yeah.
+2 or +1 or a mark, just a tally mark. And now, what I did with this depended. Sometimes I threw it out at the end of the week. I told them it was bonus points. Where
Right.
it went depended. It was random. But
Yeah.
but
That's
I
sorta
did
similar to what I
do
did,
that, and I
but-
did keep track. And
My problem was the beginning of the semester before I knew all of their names. I didn't want to interrupt the flow by saying, what's your name? I need to get down the.
Well, I
ask
guess
the
that would be a
question.
different question, and my
Yeah.
answer to that is I would always take a day or two to learn everybody's
Yeah.
name, but I'll let somebody else give you some suggestions now.
I hand out a ticket when a kid asks the first question in class on a day, and then after that, no more ticket for him in that aspect.
Oh.
And then at the end of the day, he's written his name on it, he's turned it in, and I've got a pile of tickets. I know who talked.
That's a good idea. I like that. Thank you. And if you have other suggestions, feel free to email me or catch me after the talk, because I'm welcome to any ideas. Thank you all so much.